The date, August 6, 1945. The place, Japan, specifically the city of Tokyo. An official at the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation noticed something strange. Hiroshima's radio station had gone completely silent. Japanese military bases immediately tried to contact the army monitoring post in Hiroshima, but there was no response, just complete silence. Not only from the radio station or military bases, but from the entire city of Hiroshima. August 9, 1945. Another Japanese city fell into silence, Nagasaki. But this silence wasn't because people vanished without explanation, like in a sci-fi movie, and it wasn't because of an alien invasion. This silence came from a decision made by one man, a man who chose to unleash a secret weapon, the most powerful bomb ever created in human history, the atomic bomb. A decision that killed over 220,000 people in the blink of an eye. A decision that turned 2 entire cities into ashes. A decision that even the most brutal tyrants in human history wouldn't dare to make. The man responsible for that decision was the President of the United States. In today's video, we'll uncover who really was and how one single decision placed his name alongside the worst tyrants in history, next to Hitler and Stalin. And we'll ask, what led him to make such a decision? One day, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki woke up to clear skies. Students were in their classrooms, workers were at their factories. Everyone was just trying to get through life, trying to stay productive in the middle of a brutal war that had lasted for 6 years. But in a single moment, everything disappeared. A blinding flash of light, exploding fire, terror in their eyes, and thick black smoke swallowing both cities. Hundreds of thousands died in just seconds. But the strangest part? The man who gave the order wasn't a madman like Hitler or a bloodthirsty dictator like Stalin. It was someone sitting in the White House, in a country that claimed to stand for democracy. But to understand how things reached this moment, we need to go back in time a little, a time when nuclear bombs didn't even exist. But my friend, the real danger was already there, inside human nature. In the early 20th century, the world was living through a moment of progress and prosperity, new inventions, new technologies, new sciences. But in the middle of all that, certain men emerged, men who believed in one thing only: power. Not just political leaders, but tyrants and dictators. They promised their people glory, progress, and prosperity, but instead, they led them straight into the fire. And in no time, instead of trying to build the best car or invent the best medicine, everyone was racing to build the most powerful weapon. And it all started with a man with a short mustache, a man the whole world knows. In 1889, Adolf Hitler was born in the town of Braunau, Austria. A child in a poor family, struggling through a hard life with a violent father who regularly beat him. Hitler wasn't a bright student. He failed in school, and when he tried to join the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, he was rejected, not once, but twice. The evaluator said he simply wasn't suited for art. In 1914, with the start of World War I, Hitler joined the German army, just a regular soldier. But during his time in the military, he felt something for the first time, a sense of belonging. He began to love war, violence, and the strict military discipline. Along with that came growing hatred, racism, and resentment toward most people, especially Jews. After Germany's crushing defeat in 1918 at the end of World War I, and following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh and humiliating conditions on Germany, Hitler's feelings of revenge began to grow. He believed that great Germany had been humiliated and that the entire world had united to bring Germany down into poverty and backwardness. And that's when he made himself a promise that one day he would bring Germany back as the strongest nation on earth. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party purely by coincidence. He had been assigned as a spy for the German police, and his job was to infiltrate and monitor the party's members. But instead, he was influenced by the ideas of the party's founder, Anton Drexler, who strongly believed in anti-Semitic ideology. That party would later be transformed, by Hitler himself, into what became known as the Nazi Party. After failing to become an artist, Hitler became a master of words. His speeches were like a magician's wand. He could use them to persuade millions. He managed to convince the German people that Jews and communists were their enemies, that the Treaty of Versailles was unjust, and that one day Germany must rise again. After years of planning, and specifically in 1933, following careful strategy, political maneuvers, and behind-the-scenes deals, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Just a few weeks later, there was a deliberate attack on the Reichstag building. The German parliament went up in flames. And of course, the one behind the fire was Hitler himself. He used it as an excuse to frame a member of the German Communist Party in order to eliminate them from parliament and discredit the entire movement. From that point on, Hitler began turning Germany into a totalitarian state. He banned all political parties, silenced opposition, and officially launched what he called the Third Reich. During his rule, Hitler established one of the most notorious police forces in Europe, the Gestapo. He unleashed them into the streets to suppress any opposition and filled prisons with people who held dissenting views. Under his command, the infamous Night of the Long Knives took place, a wave of extrajudicial killings carried out to eliminate political rivals and tighten his grip on power. And once he had crushed all opposition, Hitler turned to enforcing his violent ideology to cleanse Germany of all those he considered undesirable, with Jews at the very top of his list. In 1935, Hitler issued the infamous Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship and legal rights, banned marriage between Jews and the Aryan race, and left them isolated in their own country. Then, in 1938, came the terrifying Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Thousands of Jewish synagogues and businesses were destroyed, and hundreds of civilians were killed in a state-sanctioned wave of violence. While the rest of the world was still recovering from World War I, Hitler was already preparing for World War II. He began by annexing Poland and Czechoslovakia into Germany, and on September 1, 1939, Germany launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. And with that, World War II began. Hitler's brutality wasn't limited to military invasions or expanding territory. As the war progressed, he began carrying out his terrifying plan known as the Final Solution. It was a systematic effort to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Death camps like Auschwitz, Belzec, and Treblinka were established, designed for mass murder. Every day, trains arrived carrying thousands of people, women, children, and the elderly, to be gassed in chambers, burned alive, or even subjected to horrific medical experiments. Over 6 million Jews were killed in these extermination camps, along with millions of others, including communists, gypsies, people with disabilities, and black individuals. Hitler didn't stop at genocide. He devastated all of Europe from east to west. His forces swept through France, attacked Italy, occupied Norway, and fought brutal battles in the Soviet Union where millions died, not just from combat, but from hunger, cold, and sheer exhaustion. Even within Germany itself, the people were suffering under Hitler's rule. The nation lived in a constant state of fear. No one dared criticize him or even speak freely because execution was always waiting. And even the youth weren't spared. Hatred was planted in their hearts from a young age. Hitler indoctrinated children with Nazi ideology and turned teenagers into soldiers carrying weapons into war. But by the start of 1945, everything was falling apart. Allied forces had reached Berlin, and the Third Reich collapsed, and with it, Hitler fell. He shot himself in his underground bunker, choosing death over facing justice. But even in death, he left behind a country in ruins. Not just a country, but an entire continent shattered by war. Adolf Hitler wasn't just a dictator. He was the living embodiment of hatred. if you think Hitler was the only dictator of that era, then let me tell you, he wasn't. On the other side of the war, there was another brutal dictator, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was older than Hitler and even had a bigger mustache, but he was no different when it came to being a ruthless tyrant responsible for the deaths of millions. In 1878, Joseph Jugashvili was born in the town of Gori in Georgia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Jugashvili, who would later change his name to Joseph Stalin, and that's the name history would remember him by. His beginnings didn't hint at the fact that he would become one of the most terrifying tyrants in history. He was born into a poor family and enrolled in a religious school, but showed little interest in spiritual teachings. Stalin started rebelling early in life, drawn to the ideas of Marxist revolution. Soon, he got involved in underground activities, theft, sabotage, and agitation, all under the banner of social justice. After being arrested multiple times, he eventually found work at a meteorological observatory in Tbilisi, but used his free time to carry out revolutionary organizing. He incited workers, organized strikes, led protests, and gave impassioned speeches to the public. And since prison never really broke him, Stalin was often exiled instead. He was deeply influenced by the revolutionary leader Vladimir Lenin, and because of that, he joined the Bolshevik Party. He played a key role in the Russian Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsar and led to the founding of the world's first communist state. After the revolution, while everyone else was fighting openly for power, Stalin moved quietly. He steadily climbed the ranks, eliminated his rivals with precision, and built a strong network of loyal supporters, all while waiting for the right moment to strike. In 1924, Lenin died. At the time, Stalin was serving as the party's general secretary, and he joined a ruling triumvirate with Kamenev and Zinoviev. Stalin began to distance himself from global communism and instead promoted the idea of socialism in one country. He eventually defeated both Kamenev and Zinoviev and also managed to expel Leon Trotsky, who had remained committed to the idea of international communism. With his rivals removed, Stalin became the general secretary of the Communist Party and the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. And from that moment on, the era of terror began. Stalin became a dominating force over the entire Soviet Union, as if the very definition of a tyrant was made just for him. His portrait was everywhere. His name was untouchable. His voice was the law. He ruled the people through fear. He tried to accelerate industrial and agricultural production, no matter the cost to human life. He forced farmers to hand over their crops to the state and imposed a system of collectivized farming. The result? Massive famines that swept across the country. The most infamous of these was the Holodomor in Ukraine, which claimed the lives of over 4 million people. People were starving to death inside the country, while grains and food were being exported abroad. And just as Hitler tried to cleanse Germany, Stalin also tried to purify the Soviet Union. He launched the campaign known as the Great Purge, a series of brutal crackdowns and political persecutions across the USSR. Arrests, executions, and show trials, that's what defined the purge. Hundreds of thousands were either killed or imprisoned. The campaign targeted every segment of society: military officers, intellectuals, religious leaders, and even veteran members of the Communist Party. People vanished from their homes overnight. Fathers were executed in front of their children, with no charges, no evidence, nothing. And for those who weren't killed, something far worse was waiting: the Gulag camps. In the frozen wastelands of Siberia, millions of prisoners were forced to work under inhuman conditions, backbreaking labor, with no food, no heat, no mercy. The work itself was enough to kill them slowly without costing Stalin a single bullet. Under his rule, Stalin turned the entire country into a prison, a massive labor camp without walls. After eliminating all opposition within the Soviet Union, Stalin turned his attention to settling scores with countries he saw as enemies of the Soviet state. He started with Japan and Manchuria, then moved on to Finland, And of course, he entered World War II after attempting to invade Poland. Stalin, who had originally signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, was later manipulated by the United States and Britain into joining a war that wasn't originally his, a war that ended up costing the lives of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians. In 1941, after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union and following the failure of Soviet military leaders to defend the borders, Stalin ordered the execution of many of them. Soon after, Soviet commanders and Red Army soldiers entered the Battle of Stalingrad as if it were their final stand, because if they failed, a madman was waiting to execute them. And although the Red Army eventually triumphed by the end of World War II, the human cost was absolutely horrifying. More than 20 million Soviets were killed during the war. But despite all of that, Stalin never learned the lesson. He continued his reign of terror even after the war. Anyone who dared to speak out was immediately arrested. Newspapers, education, and the arts, everything was under strict state censorship. Even those closest to him weren't safe from suspicion. Stalin constantly changed his personal guards, paranoid that someone might try to assassinate him. And yet, the Soviet media portrayed him as a caring father, a bringer of justice, and the symbol of socialist progress. All of this continued until 1953. Stalin died in his bed from a stroke. Only after his death did the truth begin to surface, and future Soviet leaders would eventually acknowledge Stalin's crimes and the massacres he orchestrated. Mussolini, just like Hitler, ruled Germany, and Stalin ruled the Soviet Union. There was a third tyrant who rose to power in Italy, Benito Mussolini. He played a major role in World War II and was one of the key reasons behind Europe's destruction. In a small town called Dovia in the year 1883, Benito Mussolini was born. His father was a socialist blacksmith, and his mother was a devout schoolteacher. Mussolini didn't start out as a tyrant. He began as an angry journalist. He constantly wrote against the system, attacked capitalism, and supported socialist ideals, just like his family. But later, he turned against socialism altogether. Mussolini didn't have a consistent ideology. He was chaotic to the core, and his one true passion in life was power. After World War I, Italy came out heavily damaged, with a collapsed economy, soaring unemployment, political chaos, and widespread fear of a communist takeover. Mussolini seized the moment. He formed a militant group of Italian nationalists called the Black Shirts and founded the Fascist Party, which didn't behave like a political party, but more like a gang of thugs and enforcers. In 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome with his supporters to showcase his power. At that point, the weak Italian king chose to avoid confrontation and appointed Mussolini as prime minister. From that moment on, Italy began its transformation into a fascist state. Of course, Mussolini soon became a full-blown dictator and launched widespread campaigns of repression. He abolished political parties, silenced the press, hunted down dissidents, and threw them in prison. He transformed himself into an absolute leader, a man who couldn't be questioned or held accountable. But Mussolini wasn't satisfied with internal control. He dreamed of building an empire that would turn Italy into a new Rome. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia and used chemical weapons against civilians. He later intervened in the Spanish Civil War on the side of fellow fascist Francisco Franco, then went on to occupy Albania and expand into the Balkans. Despite all of this, Mussolini was not a skilled military strategist. He was reckless and unfit for modern warfare. And in 1939, he made the biggest mistake of his life. He formed an alliance with Adolf Hitler. So when World War II began, Mussolini found himself trapped in a game far bigger than he could handle. He tried to invade Greece and failed 3 times. He entered North Africa but was defeated in Libya by the British Army. With every loss, Italian soldiers died, Italian cities were destroyed, and the people paid the price. Inside Italy, Mussolini continued to crush any opposition. He arrested communists, socialists, and even liberals. He forced schools to teach his quotes, and his portrait was plastered across every public institution. But all that so-called power and image, it was built on nothing but emptiness. Because Mussolini wasn't a strong leader, he was just a skilled performer. His speeches were loud and theatrical. He would yell, make sharp hand gestures, and always puff out his chest to look powerful. But behind the act, he lived in constant fear of collapse and death. By 1942, Italy was on the edge. The military was defeated, the people were starving, and the country suffered from shortages in food, resources, and weapons. The public was furious, and almost everyone turned against the war. So the Italian king ordered Mussolini's arrest. But Hitler and his special forces rescued him and put him back in power for a short while. But in April 1945, as Berlin was collapsing, Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, disguised in a German soldier's uniform. But he failed. The Italian resistance captured him, and he was executed by firing squad. His body was then hung in a public square, on display for the furious crowds to see. And even though Mussolini was the least bloody of the major dictators, he remains a modern symbol of tyranny, a man who started with words and ended in blood. We all tend to think that tyrants meet their end through military defeat, the fall of their capitals, or by being killed in brutal ways. Hitler took his own life in the ruins of Berlin. Stalin died in bed, consumed by paranoia and fear of his own allies. Mussolini was executed and hung in public before the eyes of his people in Milan. But among them, there was another kind of tyrant. He didn't enter war with fiery speeches or massive military parades. He entered it with the push of a button, from the comfort of his office in the White House. That man was Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States of America. Truman was born in 1884 in the state of Missouri. He had a passion for music and history and learned to play the piano from a young age. By the time he was 16, he joined the Democratic National Committee, launching a very early political career. That early start meant he never finished high school, and he even tried to join the army before World War I, but was rejected due to poor eyesight. Still, Truman climbed the political ladder, and by 1934, he secured a seat in the U.S. Senate. But back then, Truman wasn't seen as a future leader. He was just an unremarkable vice president, chosen by President Franklin D. Roosevelt mostly to balance political factions. But suddenly, in April 1945, Roosevelt died. And just like that, Truman found himself president, the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. He was, in many ways, lucky. World War II was already nearing its end. But then he made one single decision that would make history remember him with condemnation to this very day. When Truman took office, he also inherited a top-secret project that had been in development for years, a program known as the Manhattan Project. A project built to create a weapon the world had never seen before, a bomb capable of wiping out an entire city in just a few seconds. On July 17, 1945, the Potsdam Conference was held in Germany. The key participants were the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, the United Kingdom, led by Winston Churchill, and the United States, represented by its new president, Harry Truman. The purpose of the meeting was to decide how to manage Germany after its defeat in World War II. And on August 2nd, the conference concluded, with all sides reaching agreements on post-war peace treaties. Among those agreements was the Potsdam Declaration, a final ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, or face prompt and utter destruction. But Japan's prime minister at the time, Kantaro Suzuki, gave no official response to the declaration. President Truman took that silence as a rejection, a sign that the Japanese Empire was ignoring the warning. At that moment, Truman faced a historic decision. Should he deploy the weapon that could end the war in an instant? He didn't hesitate. Truman issued the order to bomb Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki just 3 days later on August 9. His justification? To end the war quickly and save American lives. On August 6, 1945, the American aircraft Enola Gay, a Boeing B-29 bomber, took off carrying the world's first deployed atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped over the city of Hiroshima, and within seconds, the city was reduced to ashes. After all contact was lost with Hiroshima's military bases and radio stations, a young officer from the Japanese General Staff was ordered to travel to Hiroshima to verify the reports of an explosion. Around 3 hours later, and still 160 kilometers away from the city, the officer witnessed a horrifying sight: a massive cloud of smoke rising into the sky, the aftermath of the atomic bomb. As the smoke cleared, he saw the city engulfed in flames. The blast in Hiroshima instantly killed around 70,000 people, but by the end of the year, due to burns, radiation, and related illnesses, the death toll had reached 140,000. Other reports estimated that by 1950, the number of deaths had risen to 200,000. But Truman didn't stop there, as if he wanted to erase the legacy of past tyrants and claim the title of the single man responsible for the most deaths in World War II. Just 3 days later, on the morning of August 9, 1945, the B-29 bomber boxcar took off, carrying the second atomic bomb, Fat Man. This time, the target was the city of Nagasaki. At exactly 11 a.m., the bomb was dropped. 43 seconds later, it detonated, and yet another city was turned to ash. Around 75,000 people died instantly in the explosion. By the end of the year, the total death toll had reached 80,000. In a matter of seconds, over 220,000 human beings were reduced to ashes. And after that, Truman appeared smiling, declaring, "I saved lives and ended the war." But Truman wasn't like Hitler, who openly despised humanity. He wasn't like Stalin, who built forced labor camps. And he wasn't like Mussolini, who screamed through his speeches. But despite all that, he was the most dangerous tyrant of them all, because he killed while smiling. He killed hundreds of thousands with the push of a single button from his desk, then went on television to talk about democracy. And in the end, no one accused him of war crimes. He walked away as a historic hero, a symbol of victory. While other tyrants fell on the battlefield, Truman entered history as the first Democrat to wield the world's most destructive weapon. And just as history will remember him as the man who ended World War II, it will also remember that the first person to use nuclear weapons was not a Nazi, not a fascist, not a communist, but the president of the nation that calls itself the leader of the free world. And all of that happened because of one thing: a button and a decision. And with that, we've reached the end of our story.